Bueno, estamos viendo allí el conteo. Estamos viendo allí el conteo. Estamos contando. Bueno, estamos viendo allí el conteo. Ahora mismo han tomado un receso. Estamos viendo allí el conteo. Estamos contando. Bueno, estamos viendo allí el conteo. Ahora mismo han tomado un receso. Estamos viendo allí el conteo. Ya varios estados, repito, han emitido, o mejor dicho, el vicepresidente ha abierto allí varios sobres de los certificados de los colegios electorales y han tomado un receso en este momento. Vamos a seguir viendo allí las imágenes. Han salido algunos senadores del salón principal. Acaban de comenzar la sesión. Creo que es un tema de objeción. Han presentado una objeción allí. Bueno, un día histórico. Mientras esto está sucediendo en las afueras del Congreso en Washington, hay una gran manifestación. Yo voy a intentar en este momento también compartir esas imágenes ahora mismo. Un día histórico, repito, la expectativa de aquellas personas que amamos la libertad, de aquellas personas que eh, estamos apoyando sin duda al presidente Trump por todo lo que ha significado su alianza en favor de nuestra libertad. Eh, bueno, estamos muy pendientes de lo que pueda suceder hoy. La expectativa, bueno, eh, ver qué suceden con estas objeciones que se están presentando en el Congreso de algunos estados, entre ellos Mississippi, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, Pensilvania y Georgia. Bueno, reiterar que el día de ayer se repitió la historia que el pasado 3 de noviembre sucedió con las elecciones presidenciales en los Estados Unidos, luego de que los dos senadores que faltaban por, en este caso, contarse, debido a que hubo un empate técnico en noviembre. Los dos senadores republicanos iban a la cabeza a eso de la medianoche, luego se paró el conteo y en la madrugada los candidatos demócratas tomaron la delantera. Vemos la misma curva que vimos en las elecciones presidenciales, una curva de inyección de votos en esas horas de la madrugada, lo que complica el escenario a futuro. Si ha de ser confirmado Biden como presidente de los Estados Unidos, contaría con el apoyo total del Congreso y el Senado, y en caso de que prosperen las objeciones a estos colegios electorales que se denuncian fraudulentos, le tocaría gobernar al presidente de los Estados Unidos. Por supuesto, esto es un escenario especulativo. El caso de que esta objeción prospere, pero en dado caso de que esto prospere así, le tocaría gobernar al presidente de los Estados Unidos sin el Senado y sin el Congreso de los Estados Unidos, atrincherándose, digamos, en el poder constitucional del veto presidencial. Bueno, así van las cosas a este momento. Yo estoy intentando mostrar, mientras este receso continúa, algunas imágenes de el rally, de la marcha que hay a las afueras del Congreso de los Estados Unidos. Es una cantidad importante de personas que están manifestándose allí en Washington, D.C. Aquí me está interrumpiendo aquí esto. Vamos a chequear. Sigue allí, bueno, ahí pareciera verse a, no sé si es un asistente o Nancy Pelosi la que está allí arriba en el puesto. Sí, pareciera ser Nancy Pelosi.
The chair will remind members of the need to adhere to the decorum requirements of the chamber as laid out in the speaker's announced policies of January 4th, 2021, in accordance with the guidance and advice of the attending physician. Members advised to remain in the chamber only if they are participating in debate and must wear a mask at all times. Guidance and advice of the attending physician. Members advised to remain in the chamber only if they are participating in debate and must wear a mask at all times, even when under recognition for debate. Members must also practice proper social distancing when present in the chamber. Let the record show that there is a gross violation of this guidance from the attendance.
Loreto, si estás escuchando ahora, ¿me estás escuchando ahora?
Interest of your own health, and as an example to the American people, abide by the numbers, now up to 25 on each side.
Ahí estamos escuchando
a in this stage of the development. Okay, pursuant to Senate Concurrent Resolution 1,
a Nancy Pelosi.
Pursuant to Senate Concurrent Resolution 1 and Section 17 of Title III of the United States Code, when the two houses withdraw from the joint session to count the electoral vote for separate consideration of an objection, a representative may speak to the objection for 5 minutes and not more than once. Debate shall not exceed 2 hours, after which the chair will put in the question, shall the objection be agreed to? The clerk will report the objection made in the joint session.
Objection to counting the electoral votes of the state of Arizona. We, a member of the House of Representatives and a United States Senator, object to the counting of the electoral votes of the state of Arizona.
Ahí explican que están haciendo objeción a los votos del estado de Arizona.
Signed, Paul Gosar, Representative, State of Arizona. Ted Cruz, Senator, State of Texas.
The chair will endeavor to alternate recognition between members seeking support of the objection and members seeking opposition to the objection. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to object to a number of states that did not follow the constitutional requirement for selecting electors. Madam Speaker, this is something that is clear that our founding fathers debated about as a fundamental decision of how we choose our president. There was a lot of back and forth. If anyone reads the founding documents of our country about the different versions they went through to ultimately come up with a process where each state has elections.
Les explico un poco a los que se están conectando ahora. Disculpa que interrumpa aquí al senador, muy importante. Lo que acaba de suceder es que en la sesión donde el vicepresidente Pence, quien es el que preside esta sesión conjunta, un grupo de senadores rechazó, objetó la certificación de los votos electorales del estado de Arizona. Es el primer estado en objetarse. En este momento, Nancy Pelosi toma, digamos, la dirección de este debate y allí mismo estamos oyendo a los senadores argumentar la objeción de este colegio electoral. Repito, el primer colegio electoral en objetarse en la Cámara es el estado de Arizona. Cuando esto sucedió, todo el mundo se levantó de pie y en aplausos en función de objetar estos votos del colegio electoral del estado de Arizona.
To end, Madam Speaker. We have to follow the constitutional process. Now, there might be reasons why some people don't like the process laid out by a legislative body. Madam Speaker, I served on one of those legislative bodies when I was in the state legislature for 12 years. I served on the House and Governmental Affairs Committee where we wrote the laws for our state's elections. And I can tell you, when we had to make changes, those were extensively negotiated. We would have people on both sides come, Republicans and Democrats, Madam Speaker, would get together to work through those changes, any minute change, to how a precinct would function, to how a change would be made in the time of an election, signature requirements, all the many things that involve a clerk carrying out the duties in each parish, in our case. You would see people come and give testimony. Madam Speaker, both sides could come. Clerks of court were there in the hearing rooms. It was an open process, by the way, not behind closed doors in a smoke-filled room where somebody might want to bully a Secretary of State to get a different version that might benefit them or their party or their candidate. That's not what our founding fathers said is the process. Maybe it's how some people wanted to carry it out, but they laid out that process. And so when we would have to make those changes, they were in public view. They were heavily debated. And then ultimately, those laws were changed in advance of the election so everybody knew what the rules were. People on both sides knew how to play the rules before the game started, not getting somewhere in the process and saying, well, you don't think it's going to benefit you, so you try to go around the Constitution. That's not how our system works. It's gotten out of hand. And so President Trump has called this out. And President Trump has stood up to it. So many of us have stood up to it. And in fact, over 100 of my colleagues, Madam Speaker, asked the Supreme Court to address this problem just a few weeks ago. And unfortunately, the court chose to punt. They didn't answer it one way or the other. They didn't want to get in the middle of this discussion. We don't have that luxury today. We have to discuss this. We have to fix this. In fact, on our first full day of this Congress, many of us brought legislation onto the House floor to start fixing the problems with our elections, to restore integrity to the election process, which has been lost by so many millions of Americans. And we had a vote. Every single Republican voted to reform the process. Every single Democrat voted against it. They don't want to fix this problem. But the Constitution is our guide. And it's time we start following the Constitution. It's time we get back to what our founding fathers said is the process for selecting electors. That's the legislatures. In public view, not behind closed doors, not smoke-filled rooms, not bullying somebody that might give you a better ruling. Let's get back to rule of law and follow the Constitution, Madam Speaker. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Without objection, gentlewoman is recognized for
Madam
5 minutes.
Speaker, this day marks a crossroads for American democracy. Those who object to the counting of the Electoral College votes, which reflect the votes of the American people, want to substitute their preferences for the voters' choice. That's not what our Constitution requires, and it's at odds with the American Democratic Republic. If Congress selects the next president instead of American voters, we'll have no need for an electoral college. In fact, we'd have no need for presidential elections at all. We'd be moving from a government elected by the people to a government selected by those already governing. That's not America. In the United States, we abide by the choices of the people, not an elite few. The framers of our Constitution considered whether to have Congress select the president and specifically rejected it. Instead, they wrote Article 2 and the 12th Amendment. Article 2 creates the Electoral College, where each state appoints electors. Laws of all 50 states and DC require electors to vote for the winner of the state's popular election. Each state provides for the orderly conduct of elections, including lawful challenges, recounts, and the like. The 12th Amendment is what brings us to today. It says the electors meet in their states. That happened December 14th. The amendment says the electors shall cast their votes, sign and certify them, transmit them to a seal. That's been done. The sealed envelopes containing the signed certified ballots from each state's electors, reflecting the votes of the people, were in those mahogany boxes. The 12th Amendment directs the president, as the vice president, as the president of the Senate, to do only this: open the sealed envelopes, and then the vote shall be counted. Simple. It doesn't say counted in a manner that some members of Congress or the vice president might prefer. No. The votes are simply to be counted as certified and transmitted by the states. During Reconstruction after the Civil War, more than one slate of electors were appointed by states. Dueling lists were sent and protracted processes were undertaken in presidential elections. And as a result, to make an orderly process, Congress enacted the Electoral Count Act of 1887. This law governs our proceedings today. The act provides dispute resolution mechanisms. Under the ECA, if the governor certifies a slate of electors and there are no competing slates from that
Por lo que
state,
estoy
the
viendo, lo que
governor's
estoy leyendo en
certified
este
slate must be
momento,
counted.
pareciera
Today,
ser
every
que
single slate of
estas
electors, one by
objeciones que se
Joe
están
Biden
haciendo
or one by
a los
Donald Trump,
votos del
got
colegio
their
electoral
governor's certification. Not a single state
será
submitted a
más que
competing slate.
todo
There's
un
no
simbolismo
distinctions at all. The
en
2020 election was
en
the
favor
most
de
secure
las
election
demandas
conducted
presentadas
in
por el
modern
presidente
history.
Trump. Sin
Challenges
embargo,
were
pareciera en
resolved
la
by
carta que
lawful
acaba de
recounts
ser
and audits.
publicada de
The
parte de la
result,
oficina del
Vice
vicepresidente de
President
los
Biden
Estados
won the
Unidos, Mike
2020
Pence,
election. More than
que
60
no
lawsuits
objetará
were
él,
filed.
no
Nothing elements
desertificará
of the election
ninguno de
process.
estos
None of
votos
these
electorales
lawsuits
que han
prevailed.
sido
Why?
demandados como
As even
fraudulentos.
President Trump
Sin embargo,
owned
hasta
his
ahora
own
seguimos
voting
escuchando
story.
las
There was no
objeciones
evidence of any
y las
wrongdoing by which
evidencias
changed the
que
outcome.
varios
The
senadores
people spoke.
y
It was not a
congresistas
close election.
están
The margin of
presentando
victory
en
for Biden
contra
in
de
2020
algunos
was larger
estados,
than
entre ellos
Trump's margin
Arizona.
in 2016. In fact, the Biden victory is one of the most decisive in modern times, exceeding the margin enjoyed by Reagan when he defeated Carter in 1980. Congress has gathered in joint session to count electoral votes every 4 years since 1789. I understand the disappointment people feel when their candidate for president loses. I've felt the same several times in my voting life. When that happens, it's not an invitation to upend the Constitution and the laws of the United States. It's an invitation to work with the new president for the good of the country and to wait for the next election in 4 years if you're dissatisfied. In that spirit, I urge my colleagues to uphold the American democracy and reject the objection, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Esta persona está rechazando la objeción que se ha hecho a la votación, esta congresista,
For what purpose does the
a
gentleman
las
from
votos de
Ohio
Arizona.
seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise to support the objection.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, Americans instinctively know there was something wrong with this election. During the campaign, Vice President Biden would do an event and he'd get 50 people at the event. President Trump, at just one rally, gets 50,000 people. President Trump increases vote with African Americans, increases vote with Hispanic Americans, won 19 of 20 bellwether counties, won Ohio by 8, Iowa by 8, and Florida by 3. Got 11 million more votes than he did in 2016, and House Republicans won 27 of 27 toss-up races. But somehow, the guy who never left his house wins the election. 80 million Americans, 80 million of our fellow citizens, Republicans and Democrats, have doubts about this election. And 60 million people, 60 million Americans think it was stolen. But Democrats say, no problem, no worries, everything's fine. We asked for an investigation. We asked Chairman Nadler, Chairwoman Maloney for an investigation. They said no. Wouldn't want to investigate something that half the electorate has doubts about. It's just the presidency of the United States. Why? Why not one single investigation? Why not even one single hearing over the last 9 weeks in the United States House of Representatives? Why? Because all the Democrats care about is making sure President Trump isn't president. For 4.5 years, that's all they've cared about. July 31st, 2016, before he was elected the first time, Jim Comey's FBI takes out the insurance policy, opens an investigation on the president based on nothing. May 17th, 2017, Bob Mueller named special counsel. 2 years, they investigate the Russia hoax, 19 lawyers, 40 agents, and $40 million of taxpayer money for nothing. December 18th, 2019, Democrat House members vote to impeach President Trump. based on an anonymous whistleblower with no firsthand knowledge, who was biased against the president and who worked for Joe Biden. But none of that worked. As hard as they tried, none of that worked. They threw everything they had at him. So what they do next? They changed the rules. They changed the election law, and they did it in an unconstitutional fashion. And that's what we're going to show over the next several hours of debate. The Constitution is clear, as Whip Scalise just said. State legislatures and only state legislatures set election law. In Arizona, the law says voter registration ends on October 5th. Democrats said, we don't care what the law says. They went to a court, got an Obama-appointed judge to extend it 18 days. No debate, as Steve talked about. No debate, no discussion, you just did it. Pennsylvania, same thing. Pennsylvania law says mail-in ballots have to be in by 8 p.m. election day. Democrat Supreme Court said, nope, we're going to extend it. Election day doesn't end on Tuesday now. They took it to Friday. Extended the election 3 days, not the legislature, partisan Supreme Court. Pennsylvania law says mail-in ballots require signature verification. Democrat Secretary of State said, nope, I'm going to decide by myself that it doesn't. For 2.6 million ballots. Pennsylvania law says mail-in ballots can't be processed until election day. Some counties said no. And you can imagine which counties they were. Democrat-run counties said no and allowed ballots to be cured and fixed before election day. They did an in-run around the Constitution in every state that Republicans will object to today. Every single one. It was a pattern. It was their template. They did it in Arizona. They did it in Georgia. They did it in Michigan. They did it in Pennsylvania. They did it in Nevada. They did it in Wisconsin. And yet some of our members, some members say, don't worry about it. We shouldn't do anything. Just let it go. It was just 6 states who violated the Constitution. What if it's 10 states next time? What if it's 15? What if in 2024, 2028, it's 26 states? What if it's half the states do an end run around the Constitution clearly spells out? We are the final check and balance. The authority rests with us, the United States Congress, the body closest to the American people, right where the founders wanted it. We should do our duty. We should object to and vote for this objection to the Arizona electors. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the objection.
The gentleman is recognized without objection for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, a little more than 2 months ago, America performed an extraordinary feat. Under some of the most trying circumstances in our history, our fellow citizens conducted a free and fair election, vindicating our founders' belief once again that we were capable of self-government and a peaceful transition of power. On November 3rd, the American people chose Joe Biden to be their next president by an enormous margin. The successful conduct of that election, among the most secure in American history, was not an accident. It was the result of the dedicated work of thousands of volunteers, canvassers, poll workers, electors, and state and local election officials. When the conduct of any state election was challenged, the courts, through judges appointed by Democrats and those appointed by Republicans, heard unsubstantiated claims of fraud, found they had no merit, and said so. But most important, the American people persevered. In the midst of the worst pandemic in a century, America had one of the most impressive elections in a century with historic voter turnout. Our fellow citizens did their civic duty. The question we face today is, will we do ours? That we are here with a substantial number of our members seeking to overturn the election is remarkable, tragic, and all too predictable. For it is the natural result of a locomotive set in motion months ago with a myth. For weeks and weeks before, during, and after our election, a dangerous falsehood was propagated. that our election would be marred by massive fraud. Never mind, it was the same election which brought the very men and women to this chamber who would challenge its results. What value has consistency when measured against ambition? A former senator from Georgia, remarking on a contested election over a century ago, said that able men, learned men, distinguished men, great men in the eyes of the nation seemed intent only on accomplishing a party triumph without regard to the consequences to the country. That is human nature. That is, he said, unfortunately, party nature. Was he right? We stand in a house which was once the place
En lo
of
que
giants.
comentaba
Have
de
we become
la carta
so
del
small?
vicepresidente al
Does our
presidente
oath
Trump,
to uphold the
dice:
Constitution
es mi juicio meditado que mi juramento de apoyar y defender la Constitución me limita a reclamar autoridad unilateral para determinar qué votos electorales deben contarse y cuáles no. Pareciera entonces que este debate que se está llevando a cabo en este instante quedará solo en eso, en el debate mero simbólico de los reclamos que el presidente Donald Trump, aliado de la libertad en Venezuela, ha venido ejerciendo en favor del pueblo estadounidense y en contra del fraude que ha venido denunciando.
They may cast no matter how long they serve, but it is so. And none of us can shrink from that responsibility. Nor can we console ourselves with the intoxicating fiction that we can break that oath without consequence, because doing so will not succeed in overturning the election. An oath is no less broken when the breaking fails to achieve its end. We must be mindful that any who seek to overturn an election will do injury to our Constitution, whatever the result. For just as the propagation of that dangerous myth about this election made this moment inevitable, our actions today will put another train in motion. This election will not be overturned, but what about the next, or the one after that? What shall we say when our democratic legacy is no more substantial than the air, except that we brought trouble to our own house and inherited the wind? This isn't the first time we've had a contentious election, and it won't be the last. In 1800, John Adams lost a closely contested election to Thomas Jefferson in the first peaceful transition of power from one party to another in our history. Adams was hardly pleased with the result, choosing to skip the inaugural activities, but he did what leaders are required to do in a democratic government when they lose. He went home. He went home. Jefferson, has my time expired, Mr. Speaker?
10 seconds.
Would later refer to his victory as the Revolution of 1800, but marveled that the revolution had occurred by the rational and peaceful instruments of reform, the suffrage of the people. It has never been our place to overturn an election. And if we hope to remain a democracy, it never will be.
Arizona. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
I rise to support the objection.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I join the objection to counting votes of electors from my home state of Arizona, as well as Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Nevada, because election integrity is the heart of our American constitutional republic. In a representative form of government, we must be able to trust that our elections accurately represent the will of the American voter. This is the appropriate forum anticipated and provided for by our founders to debate whether this election complied with the Constitution that we've all sworn to protect. Every particular of the Constitution is to be protected, including Article 2, Section 1. The debate as to the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election has been suppressed by the left and its propagandists in the media until today. State legislatures are required to determine the manner in which electors are chosen. Arizona names its electors on the general election ballot and identifies what candidate those electors are required to vote for should that candidate obtain the majority of votes in the general election. As part of the manner for determining electors, Arizona also establishes deadlines for voter registration.
The deadline has been in place for 30 years. This year, that voter registration deadline was October 5th. Early voting commenced 2 days later. 5 days before the deadline, a group filed a lawsuit demanding that Arizona election officials not enforce the deadline. The federal district court decided that since other states have a deadline later than Arizona's, and some even allow for registration when voting, that Arizona's new deadline would be a time he chose, not the legislator's timeline. The appellate court effectively overturned the lower court ruling and noted that the Arizona deadline established by the state legislature was sound and appropriate and complied with the Constitution. But the appellate court merely shortened the extension, the bypassing of the deadline to 10 days. The appellate court, without legal justification, also decided that everyone who registered after the legal deadline, but before the deadline created by judicial fiat, could still vote. Note that the Arizona legislature was no longer in control of determining the manner of appointing presidential electors because the court had set a new deadline, even though the appellate court found the legislature's deadline was constitutionally sound. During that window, more than 32,000 voters registered in Maricopa County alone. Here are copies of those voter registration records. In going around the deadline set by the legislature, the court ignored the Arizona legislature's obligation and right to direct the manner for choosing presidential electors as set forth in Article 2, Section 1. As a consequence of that judicial usurpation, more than 32,000 people were allowed to unlawfully cast ballots in Arizona's presidential election in 2020. The Arizona legislature seeks an independent audit of the election. The governor refuses now to call them into a special session. The Maricopa County Board of Supervisors has refused to comply with legislative subpoenas. In Arizona, the people who control the evidence related to the election have done everything possible to prevent an independent audit directed by the legislature. Arizonans have used the limited amount of records available to investigate the 2020 presidential election. Of a limited sample of 1,000 addresses of voters, they found 539 voters did not live at the addresses on the voter rolls. Here is a stack of 1,000 declaration of affidavits supporting that. I object to the continuing counting the votes of Arizona electors because the federal courts went around the legislatively constructed mechanism for choosing Arizona's presidential electors, allowing tens of thousands of voters to unlawfully cast votes. The court usurped a key component of the Arizona legislature's manner of selecting presidential electors, thus violating Article 2, Section 1. The legislature is being obstructed in its efforts. And what little evidence we have, or little information we have, has produced this kind of evidence which indicates a significant problem with the integrity of the presidential election. Madam Speaker, I ask that my written comments, together with the voter registration records that reflect the 32,000 registrations permitted in contravention of state law, letters and resolutions from Arizona legislators pertaining to the count of votes from electors, along with approximately 1,000 affidavits and declarations pertaining to potential voter fraud in Arizona in the 2020 presidential election, and the statement of Congressman Randy Weber of Texas be made a part of the record.
Thank you, gentleman. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the objection.
The gentleman is recognized without objection for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank you first and all my dear beloved colleagues for your love and tenderness, which my family and I will never forget. Thank you again. Abraham Lincoln, whose name is a comfort to us all, said, "We've got the best government the world ever knew." It's best because the first 3 words of the Constitution tell us who governs here. We the people. Watch this proceeding today and tell the world with pride, as Lincoln did, about the brilliant meaning and promise of our country. Our government belongs to the people. As President Ford said, here the people rule. Today, we are in the people's house to complete the people's process for choosing the people's president. We assemble in joint session for a solemn purpose that we've all sworn a sacred oath to faithfully discharge. The 12th Amendment obligates each and every one of us to count the electoral votes to recognize the will of the people in the 2020 presidential election. We are not here, Madam Speaker, to vote for the candidate we want. We are here to recognize the candidate the people actually voted for in the states. Madam Speaker, the 2020 election is over and the people have spoken. Joe Biden received more than 80 million votes, 7 million more than President Trump, a number larger than any other president has received in U.S. history. Sweeping popular victory translated into an electoral college victory of 306 to 232, a margin which President Trump pronounced a landslide when he won by those exact same numbers in 2016. So now we count the electoral votes that were just delivered to us in the beautiful mahogany cases brought by those hardworking Senate pages. These mahogany cases contain only the 538 electoral votes that were sent in by the states, not the 159 million ballots that were cast by our constituents. Those were counted 2 months ago by hundreds of thousands of election officials and poll workers across America who risked their health and even their lives in the time of COVID to deliver what our Department of Homeland Security called the most secure election in American history. Many of these officials have endured threats of retribution, violence, and even death just for doing their jobs. Just as the popular vote was for Biden, so was the electoral vote. On December 15th, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell recognized it. The Electoral College has spoken, Senator McConnell said from the Senate floor. Today, I want to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden. Yet we have seen escalating attacks on our election with unfounded claims of fraud and corruption. More than 60 lawsuits have been brought to date seeking to overturn the results. They have failed repeatedly and they have failed spectacularly. Every objection we hear today maligning our states and their officials, both Republican and Democrat, has been litigated, adjudicated, and obliterated in both federal and state court. The president has not just had his day in court, my friends. He has had more than 2 months in court looking for a judge to embrace these arguments. In more than 50 cases, Madam Speaker, at least 88 different judges, including many appointed by the president himself, have meticulously rejected the president's claims of fraud and corruption. Take Georgia U.S. District Judge Stephen Grimberg, named to the bench by President Trump this year. Last year, he rejected Trump's prayer to block certification of Biden's victory in Georgia, saying it has no basis in fact or law. Take U.S. District Judge Brett Ludwig, another Trump nominee who took the bench in September. He dismissed a lawsuit seeking to overturn the results in Wisconsin, calling it extraordinary. A sitting president who did not prevail in his bid for re-election has asked for federal court help in setting aside the popular vote based on issues he plainly could have raised before the vote occurred. He wrote, "This court has allowed plaintiff the chance to make his case, and he has lost on the merits." Trump has asked for the rule of law to be followed, Judge Ludwig observed, and he said definitively, it has
Bueno, con las
been.
palabras de este senador,
I've been a
nosotros vamos a hacer
constitutional professor for 30 years,
una
and if I were to
pausa en esta
test my
transmisión. Los
these
invito
decisions, it would be the
a
easiest test in
ustedes
the world.
mismos poder
The plaintiffs
sintonizar
have lost
este
nearly
canal,
every
Right Side
case and every issue
Network.
in the most
Ellos
simple
están
terms.
haciendo esta
That's all they
transmisión
would have to
en vivo.
remember. There is no
Nosotros
basis
compartimos
in
por
fact or
acá
law
para
to
intentar
justify
llevar
unprecedented
algún
relief
avance de lo que
is
está
being
ocurriendo acá en los
requested
Estados
of
Unidos.
nullifying these
Ahora
elections.
mismo
We are here
se
to
están
count the
presentando
votes.
las
Let us do our
objeciones
job.
al colegio electoral del estado de Arizona. Varios congresistas, senadores, han tomado su derecho de palabra para presentar sus objeciones a los votos del colegio electoral del estado de Arizona. Le corresponde luego entonces al vicepresidente Mike Pence continuar presidiendo la sesión conjunta. Por ahora, estas objeciones están siendo presentadas ante la vocera, ante la presidenta del Congreso, Nancy Pelosi.
To challenge anyone to a duel like Alexander Hamilton or Aaron Burr. Madam Speaker, my primary objection to the electoral votes of the state of Arizona is based on the Constitution and the direction of state legislatures through state law as spelled out in the following two clauses. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 states in part, and I quote, each state shall appoint in such manner